sheep and the goats and all these grazing lands that have been set aside for these animals, just remove them completely. And imagine the amount of land that is now reserved in the United States to either for these animals to inhabit, or of course for the growing of food crops for these animals, right? Every single one of those animals came in as a result of settler colonialism, and this really was central. To go back to the experience of my family and my town, my family comes from a relatively agricultural, wealthy part of central Mexico. It was land that was gifted out, for lack of a better term, to many of the powerful conquistadors and their families, the colonizers that came in and were granted these lands. Of course, these lands were Indian lands, native lands, right? But the colonizers quickly saw the benefit for them in the simplicity, honestly, of filling them up with cattle and goats and sheep, so that they could then take these poor animals, slaughter them, and then sell them for capital, for wealth. And in a way, it's something that continues today, right? It's that dispossession of native land that has been normalized and that has been, to a certain degree, celebrated as part of the American experience, the Mexican experience. We see it in South America. We see it even here in the Bay Area, right? I hope many of you are familiar with the struggles around protecting the Tule elk up in the North Bay in Marin County. It's always so surprising to me and frustrating that I see these incredible parallels between what my town and thousands of them, thousands of towns like mine, being repeated now, and the way in which the indigenous struggle is removed from that conversation, right? And so much emphasis is played really on the kind of folkloric aspects of the dairy industry, right? Without really recognizing that, I mean, maybe not the direct ancestors, but certainly the predecessors of the people who have the huge dairy farms up in the North Bay. They're just in possession of land that was stolen, right? And ultimately, you know, one can argue, well, that's not relevant to today's existence, right? And that too is part of the settler colonialism, right? To dispossess people not just of their land, but of their ideas and what they helped achieve. One of the things that I always find it very important to highlight is that ultimately the majority of people in North America, when the Europeans arrived, lived in dense, often urban societies, right? We have this tendency to believe that indigenous folks were all these nomads, and of course many of them were. But the vast majority of people in the continent were settled, agricultural. Many of them were urban people living in dense urban cities. And I really want to emphasize that, right? The density that we see, that we now know existed in some of the cities in North America in 1491, right, were comparable to and exceeded the density that you see now in San Francisco, right? There were, I am certain, children that were born and raised and perhaps even lived their entire lives in these cities without ever leaving these urban societies. And they achieved this, of course, without the need, without the ability, right, to go out and find a slaughtered animal, a slaughtered cow, a slaughtered sheep and goat, and consume it, right? I do want to emphasize that I certainly don't think that these people were vegans, right? But they were certainly plant-based. And I believe that it was the closest we have ever achieved to being a vegan society in the history of humanity, right? They were, and to me, that's really the powerful parallel and the powerful lesson that exists for our society today, right? All too often, we see narratives that quickly descend into what I guess one could call primitivist. The idea that, oh, we need to go back to nature and abandon these urban ways of life and modernity as we know it. And nothing could be farther from the truth for me, right? We see these societies that were urban that had so many of the advantages that we have today, right? And didn't have that dependence on dispossessing land from indigenous people, didn't have the need to go and enslave millions of animals and slaughter them to feed themselves. And perhaps more importantly, also saw a lot of inequality diminished because of that. And one of the things that I regret about not doing a presentation, one of the few, is sharing with you some of the analysis that has been done in the recent past looking at the urban inequality that existed in these cities. And, some of you might know, Mexico City, as it was formerly known, Mexico Tenochtitlan, a city of about 250,000, 300,000 people built on the center of a lake, right? Again, very dense, very urban, but other cities might be less known to people, right? Of course, the Mayan cities in southern Mexico, even up here in the United States, you have places like Cahokia over where St. Louis is today. And of course, the kind of jewel, right, of pre-Columbian North America, Teotihuacan in central Mexico, a town that for all intents and purposes had negligible urban inequality, right? And what's compelling to me is that the researchers themselves, right, and I'm not talking about animal rights activists or animal liberationists, right? They themselves place this question of urban inequality on the domestication of animals, right, as one of the reasons why these towns were able to achieve what they achieved, right? It prevented what can be succinctly called the accumulation of wealth, right? Individuals and their families, their groupings were unable to become the center of that wealth. And that's really important, I think. For me, one of the few lessons that I've learned over the last few years since Seed the Commons has been doing a lot of this work is we talk about this a lot, right? We talk about the connections between animal liberation and food systems that are independent of animal exploitation, right? From not always, but often the angle of these experiences that were existing in this very land, right? We place a lot of criticism on the grazing movement, right? And it's pernicious. It really is nefarious the way that these very powerful entrenched interests are pushing on their narratives and perpetuating that settler colonialism. Many of you might have seen earlier this year, there were these presidential debates between candidates, and there was a candidate, his name escapes me, who very clearly said that, the solution to climate change, the solution to some of the things that we're dealing with today is regenerative grazing. And I didn't know if I wanted to laugh or cry when I heard that, right? Because to me, it's again, the perpetuation of these false solutions, these myths that are very lucrative to these individuals and to these vested interests, right? It's easier to point at these fictitious fantasies, these things and say, oh, well, this will help solve our current issues, instead of saying, what we should be doing is slowly, over a period of transition, take these animals and remove them from this land, rewild this land. And we've done the numbers, we've crunched the numbers at Seed the Commons, and we know full well that rewilding the amount of land that is now being set aside and reserved for grazing in North America would have an immense impact in terms of getting rid of carbon, CO2 in the atmosphere. Right? It wouldn't be an immediate solution, and it would have to be a solution that is parallel to a lot of other systems that we need to implement, of course. But it is crucial for us to begin to talk about this, right? Before we really are serious about, if we're really serious about tackling climate change. So yeah, it's been, we've been critiquing at Seed the Commons and analyzing how this present environmental movement kind of glosses over, outright ignores, or actually promotes solutions that are opposed to this, doing nothing more than rehashing these colonial narratives, you know, centering the cow and the ranchers, and you know, manipulating our heartstrings, right? Conveniently, of course, forgetting the people that are still there that benefited from that ultimately suffer the most, right? And that is important, I think, to mention in a day like today. I also want to say that, you know, it's something that has been absent a lot from the animal rights movement, the animal liberation movement, right? Our work has been, I don't know, perhaps seen as a little bit sidelined, right? Again, this emphasis on food systems and the emphasis on how these food systems can best be implemented in a very real way. We've been talking about things like veganic agriculture, you know, that something that to many people sounds very fantastical until, you know, I remind people that the densest societies the world had seen up until 1492, well, frankly, up until more modern times, right, were societies that in essence practiced veganic agriculture. Right, you certainly had no option to go and get cow manure or sheep manure, and you know, when you were hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean, and there was no no large domesticated animal that you could go and use their manure for, right? These systems that they implemented, again, some of which you might be aware of, the chinampa and the milpa, that are still the dominant forms of agriculture in many parts of the United States by indigenous people, but certainly in Mexico and Central America, right, are marginalized instead of us going and learning from these individuals and celebrating it, right? So yeah, it's been interesting over the last few years, the feeling of kind of tokenization that Seed the Commons has been around these narratives. We're very confident, and as the years go by, I'm even more confident about the need to not focus or center, you know, you might have heard the term neoliberal, you know, market-based solutions where, you know, the things we buy are ultimately what's going to make the difference. We need to be asking and demanding real systemic change, and that's going to require us to build a mass movement for that, for us to be unified. And you know, I see a lot of these things that are actively preventing us from doing that within many of the organizations and individuals involved in the movement, right? And it's heartbreaking to me because ultimately I feel that we need to be moving forward with this question of animal liberation, particularly when we have such a clear and obvious solution to it. We are continuing to do a lot of work, a lot of research, work with farmers, organize farmers, really make sure that they understand that we're there to support them. I certainly, though, wish that we were perhaps better at communicating and these ideas, because I think, to me, there are incredibly important ideas, right? This idea that we have solutions that, we don't need to copy 100%. We can adopt them little by little in a way that they make sense to us, but that could really be key components in us addressing climate change, addressing urban inequality, addressing general wealth inequality, right? Giving us healthier food, more sustainable food systems that are independent of animal exploitation. And ultimately, that's what Seed the Commons is about. If you're not familiar with Seed the Commons, I definitely encourage you to visit seedthecommons.org. We have a presence on all the major social media channels, right? And with that, I think it's coming on half an hour. So I'd be happy to take any questions, and yeah.
Thank you so much, Chema. And we did just, my lovely co-host Jacinda put a link to Seed the Commons in the chat so that everyone can find it. And I had a quick question for you. Have you done any work with Sweet Farm? They're a farmed animal rescue in Half Moon Bay, and they do talk a lot about veganic farming, and might be a good connection for Seed the Commons and Sweet Farm. They're just amazing. We did a little tour with them yesterday, and they were one of the folks we worked with for our fundraiser as well. Have you worked with them at all yet?
I don't believe so. If you go to veganic.world, it's another Seed the Commons website, another project that we have. So yeah, it's just veganic.world. We do have a list and a map there of all the different farms and farmers that we have connected with across North America. I wish there were more, but there are a significant amount there. They might be on there. I don't always do the direct contact with these farmers, but it's great to hear, right, that there's a group like that here in the Bay Area. We used to work with Lazy Millennial Farm down in Salinas. It was super exciting, because when we first met with them, they were just getting the farm launched. And it was in this very room where I am now that we started talking about this idea of doing a CSA. Of course, it wasn't necessarily super sustainable situation for them, but to me, I guess it proved the concept that there is that demand for veganic products. But again, I want to emphasize that for me, it's choices are great and all, but for me, I don't believe that the current system allows us to change it in any meaningful way by choosing what we buy, right? We need to be organizing for that more significant change systematically, and demanding that justice that I think certainly Indigenous people need, but pretty much everybody in the world needs right now.
That's so true, and it's such an important point to make, that systemic change is really the way to solve some of these major problems. The way to solve systemic problems is through systemic change. And for folks who don't know, I know you kind of briefly mentioned it, but what is the difference between veganic farming and organic farming?
Yeah, so they're certainly interlinked, right? Veganic is it's a portmanteau word between vegan and organic. So all veganic agriculture is, in theory, organic, but the vegan aspect eliminates all animal input, right? And by that, we're talking, of course, of things like manure, right? But it also removes things like blood meal and bone meal, additives, and I hate, the euphemisms we use for the dead animals that we place in our food or in the soil to grow our food, right? It completely does away with it.
It really does gloss over the gory nature of what's actually going into a lot of like not just standard farm practices, but also organic farming. It's pretty gnarly when you really look into it. It's kind of disgusting, and I think a lot of people think that just because they're buying organic, that they're not participating in those kind of farming practices, and sadly, that's just not the case.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tragic. I neglected to mention at the beginning when I was introducing myself that I had the distinct good fortune of being raised vegetarian. My father, when he was a young man, 18 years old, he left his town for the first time, and he very quickly decided that the best way for him to adapt, right, to life in Mexico City was to become a vegetarian. So he did. He raised me and my two young brothers vegetarian. And it's always so amusing because I came to the US when I was already older. But what people tend to think of as Mexican food, right, is completely unknown to me as a Mexican of a rural town. And you know, I grew up in a very traditional household in Mexico, extended family, where most of them were vegetarian. And it didn't seem so strange because, well, I mean, let's be honest, meat, at least back then, was relatively expensive for most people. My parents and my family, extended family, were not necessarily people of great means. But it also meant that cheese and all those other things that, again, today we associate strongly with Mexican food were completely absent. It's compelling to me seeing how quickly these changes have been happening, right? In my lifetime, you know, I'm a little bit over the age of 40. I've seen these changes speed up and change. And again, oftentimes because of these neoliberal ideas of free trade and deregulation that have permitted the expansion of grazing and dairying across the continent, you know, regardless of the countries. Yeah, it's interesting.
It is. It's fascinating to see how much we're changing, but in certain ways, how much we're staying, unfortunately, the same, and perpetuating some of these systems that are continuing to put a bigger divide between people in urban settings and in rural settings. Mm-hmm. These kind of practices can only continue to operate in a way that do force that separation of class. And I found it so interesting to hear about the large cities, the large pre-Columbian cities that didn't have those kind of divisions of class in such a severe and significant way.
Yeah, and again, a lot of the research is still being done. I think that there probably were things that we would call classes today, and certainly divisions between those classes, but it was the inequality really that jumps out at researchers, and again, academic researchers studying this, and the way they analyzed the inequality in North America and compared it to inequality in the so-called old world, Europe, Asia, was in a very elegant way, looking at home size. You know, we don't necessarily have the bank accounts or the counterpart of the bank accounts of people 500 years ago, but we do have a sense of how big their homes were, right? And you know, it starts to be argued that wealthier, more powerful people had bigger homes, and more humble people, poorer people, had smaller homes. So you can definitely go and look at cities from the beginning of history all the way up into today and analyze that, right? And make that analysis. And again, they saw that there was a stable, in some cases, decreasing urban inequality in North America, and an increasing inequality in the old world, right? And things very quickly changed here when you started having these domesticated animals. And I'm not only talking, of course, about the cow. The horse was also a huge component because all of a sudden it allowed people to go from one town to the other in just a matter of hours and carry off so much of their wealth, right? In North America, despite, I think, many people's vision of how things were, there were no horses. So people had to go and bring whatever they needed from anywhere else. And that made even things like war very different, right? But that also, to me, is important to connect with this question of animal liberation, because we made these animals complicit in the way we organize our societies and ultimately the way we do war.
That's true. And the way, if you didn't have the horses, the wars can't be as bloody or as significant, because you just can't bring in as many people. I mean, just right off the bat, and being up on top of a horse versus being on the same level with your opponent obviously offers you a big advantage there. These are such interesting concepts to think about. And I apologize, I misspoke about the class divisions. I meant the oppression of one class, the difference in how different classes were treated, and one class oppressing another. Thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
With Seed the Commons, obviously a big part of what you're doing is trying to encourage more veganic farming. What are other aspects of the organization?
So what we've been doing over the last few years has been doing a lot of, I guess, what could be called popular education, participating in panels like this, presentations. We've also been doing a lot of work around educating communities around this. We've done a lot of events here in San Francisco and in the Mission, particularly around educating communities of color around the important, the unknown aspects, right, of pre-Columbian native foods, and connecting it with the more political aspects, right? Because ultimately what we're doing is a lot of food politics and the politics associated with food. So a lot of popular education, research, working with farmers and supporting farmers. And it's something that I hope that, we can get more support so we can continue doing over the coming years. I think for us, that's been one of the biggest stumbling blocks, right? Finding ways to grow so we can bring that message to more people.
Yes, and definitely I encourage everybody, go to seedthecommons.org, check out the website, look at all of the different projects that they are working on, and you can also contribute to their work there. There's a donation page, and we do have a link to Seed the Commons, not only in the chat, but also on our event page on the event website, on the vendors page. It's sfworldvegfest.org. If you go to the vendors page, you will see Seed the Commons, and you will find a link to the website there, just in case you don't get it from the chat now. For the folks who are watching the recorded version of this, just wanted to put that out there. And I know, Chema, in your day job, you've also been very busy. So I really appreciate you taking time out of your extremely busy schedule today to help us, especially at this particularly busy time for you.
Yes. My day job is a union organizer, and of course we're very busy with the election. But this is also something that's very important to me, and I'm glad I got the opportunity to chat with folks around this very important issue. And I will also put in a link. We do have a campaign going on right now to do some more of this work around veganic farming. So I'm looking at the link, but yeah, definitely something that I think that a lot of people can help us out build this question of our veganic world, right? And look at it from a perspective of agriculture and popular education. So I'm going to put the link here. And as always, please share with folks, because it's important to get the word out.
That's so true. And that's the best thing that we can do. That's really a big reason why I wanted to do, even though we couldn't do our in-person Veg Fest this year, I still wanted to do some variation of a World Veg Fest because getting this opportunity every year to share this kind of information with folks in our community and then have them take that out into the world and share with their friends and family who um, may not be vegan, who may not even have any interest, in veganism. This is something that affects literally everybody. And I think when you start letting folks know that this kind of this way of thinking actually betters everybody's life, and I think that's just yet another way that we can kind of start sowing those seeds of compassion and make a better world. So I really appreciate you bringing all of your knowledge, and I hope that when we have our in-person Veg Fest again, you're able to join us.
I hope so too. And I put my email in the chat if anybody has any questions. Always happy to connect with people.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chema. It's been a delight to talk to you today. I really admire the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Let's keep in touch and work together on something in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for joining.